This now, Environmental Affairs Minister Barbara Creecy says rich countries must honour their promise to help poorer nations go green and do this by boosting climate change funds. This comes as climate talks in Glasgow, Scotland will kick off on the 31st of October. The COP26 conference will see world leaders coming together to discuss ways to address the climate change crisis. Now, to discuss this with us is energy expert Tshepo Kgadima, who joins us live in studio. Tshepo, thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here.
No, it's wonderful to have you.
eNCA, yes.
Now, COP26 is fast approaching, but I've noted with concern, Tshepo, the double speak around government's transition to clean energy. We'd have the president saying we need to move with speed to reduce our carbon footprint. And then we have perhaps Minister Mantashe going on to say we shouldn't be strong-armed by these developed nations. And that alone, I know, is the sort of protectionist rhetoric we don't want to see. We know what happened with Trump. It's myopic. But how does a country such as ours, a developing country with coal reserves that could last us to 200 years, somehow meaningfully contribute to this global initiative to reduce our carbon footprint?
Well, I think what is going to be starting in Scotland on the 31st of October until the 12th of November, it's really, I suspect it will be yet another jamboree. If anything, it will add to the tourism value for Scotland more than giving us something that is tangible. I read at length the report from the International Energy Agency that says net zero by 2050, the roadmap for global energy in terms of carbon reduction. So when you read it and when you read what even our politicians and policymakers from South Africa say, you can clearly see that there is in fact confusion and lack of understanding of the difference between energy and electricity, because by and large they're actually only concentrating on the electricity generation sector to look at how we can reduce the carbon footprint. Carbon, by the way, is very essential. It's a very useful industrial gas that is used in many applications. Some of them we take them for granted. Some people they enjoy soda beverages, whether it's in whatever soda beverage. They don't fully appreciate the fact that you need to have a CO2 in the making of that particular beverage, or even in other industrial applications. But I think what is missing in the whole discourse is that of saying, well, is electricity the only source of CO2 emissions, or are there other energy sources that are also source of energy or the CO2 emissions? And if there are other sources, and of course indeed there are, what is the solution? The solution lies more in understanding that where we are as the world today, we've got energy poverty. And having energy poverty, we actually need more energy, which the reality is that it has to be derived largely from fossil fuels. And you'll see that by what is coming out of at least leading nations, China being one of them, Australia being another, as well as Saudi Arabia.
Many are highly critical of that we're going to derive it from fossil fuels. Many are talking renewables now. Perhaps it's fitting to get to that debate where we have our renewables, that's your wind and solar, or we talk about base load, which would be our coal, and obviously nuclear. But if we confine ourselves to just the renewables, wouldn't a mix of having wind and solar and a significant reduction of coal be perhaps beneficial for the country? If we had to talk capacity and costs, what are we looking at?
Well, perhaps maybe let me phrase it this way, and I think for the first time in the history of planet Earth, you'll hear it first on eNCA. This is what I have phrased, that a megawatt is a mirage. A megawatt hour is the oasis. And the debate has been largely based on a megawatt in terms of capacity as opposed to a megawatt hour. The megawatt hour is the oasis to really tackle head-on energy poverty that is prevalent all over the globe. We have to bear this in mind. Energy has gone up so much higher, and the more intermittent energy sources that you introduce into any grid system, the more harm that it causes, not in terms of the environment, but in terms of livelihoods. Where COP26 is going to be held in the United Kingdom, it is reported that in excess of 25,000 people die a year from excessive cold, because people can no longer afford to pay for electricity that is supplied. So people lack heat and light at home, not because it's not available, but because the cost is so exorbitant. Brazil, for example, now there was a report that came out of AP News yesterday that people are having to make a difficult choice between buying electricity and buying food. That is happening right here in this country.
Yes, we're seized with the same problem right now, because I know in 2008 it was 40 cents a kilowatt, and now in 2021 we're looking at R1.09 a kilowatt. Why this increase?
Well, R1.09, by the way, that is the NERSA approved tariff on a wholesale basis. Before the middlemen come in, whether the middleman is a municipality or the other people that are intermediaries in between that sell electricity. So on average, if you were to run a poll, you'll find that people at home, for a kilowatt hour of electricity, they are paying a minimum of R1.58 and even up to over R3.50 a kilowatt hour, and hence the energy poverty that we are seeing, whereby people just can no longer afford to buy the electricity that is being produced. But that is on the one hand. On the other hand, the costs, as I mentioned earlier in the week, they come from a fundamentally flawed logic whereby when Eskom in 2008 made the decision to engage in new build 2 mega power stations, Medupi and Kusile, the fundamental flaw was in the assumption that the capital cost for building of those 2 power projects will come from tariff increases over a period of time. So the tariff increases, we have seen them going at such a level whereby we have priced ourselves as a nation from competitiveness, because energy is fundamental. As a result, we have seen a corresponding decline in demand of electricity resulting from those exorbitant tariff increases, which in any case were avoidable. The question is, was the model of financing these 2 mega power projects, was it ideal? The answer is no. Has the model of now bringing in the independent power producers who require 100% backup, by the way, whatever kilowatt hour of electricity they purport to produce has to be backed up 100% by Eskom's baseload power station. And that also exacerbated what is already a perilous situation, in that Eskom loses directly from the power it acquires, which is totally redundant, 100% of whatever it is spent, and right now they are spending well over 50 billion rand a year. By the year 2024-25, it will be over 70 billion rand from the intermittent energy sources. At the same time, they've got a gargantuan debt, the colossal debt, on the financing of these 2 projects, Medupi and Kusile, where we know there were a lot of inefficiencies, there was a lot of corruption, there was a lot of looting. But be that as it may, the debt is now at an unsustainable level. What will Eskom do against the backdrop of decreasing sales? They are selling less electricity than they did.
So
and hence I say
further.
A tariff increase is not the panacea. And then they are talking still on a per capita basis, we might be higher, but we are a smaller economy comparable to the major economies, which are still the biggest polluters of greenhouse gases.
You know, I'd have loved to actually continue the conversation around the electricity, at least the tariffs, that is. But perhaps to touch on nuclear before we close. I mean, we know with nuclear that it's a zero emissions, clean source of energy given. But there have been reservations around its costs. And also, if you'd remember, just to take you back to the politics of things, the former President Jacob Zuma was a staunch supporter or was one that advocated for nuclear. But there was another political reservation, correct me if I'm wrong, around uranium as a byproduct of nuclear power production. And particularly because we all knew that Shiva Mine belonged to the Guptas, was mining uranium. And some had alleged that probably this was to prop up the Gupta family. What would you say are the costs, before we get into the politics, what would be the cost, because several amounts are bandied about, certain figures, the cost of nuclear production in South Africa?
Well, today if you were to build a nuclear power station, Minister Mantashe is pursuing to build 2,500 megawatts of nuclear power. That will give you an energy availability factor of at least 92%. At 92%, it therefore will bring that to have 92% energy availability factor. You would spend in the region of 173 billion rand to build that power station. However, if you were to say, I need to replace that or match it with intermittent energy sources such as solar and wind, you would need to spend 362 billion rand to be able to match the 2,500 rand. So already there, the numbers are there. I don't think that is a debate. What is missing in the debate is the inordinate amount of time it takes, because nuclear is more regulated than any energy source.
But it's
on the basis you are saying.
173 billion is a lot. I mean, I wish we can actually talk on the consensual finance, which what Barbara Creecy is talking about, that we need to prioritize financing. And it cannot be just below rate loans, because that remains a debt for a nation. We need grants. We need you to literally give us money if you want us to move.
There is no one in the money. There's no one in town who can give you concessional loans. Our Reserve Bank has lost the capacity to be able to be the lender of last resort, which should have been in cases such as this. There are very few central banks globally. It is the Federal Reserve in the United States, it's the Exchequer in the United Kingdom.
But CIF must produce this money because they're committed to this project. So if they're saying they'll give us the consensual loans, I'm still on the question around, is a loan what we require to move, because it's still a lot of money, we would remain indebted to a certain extent, or it's grants that we need money given to some of these poorer nations, particularly here in Africa?
Well, if they're saying that they're going to give you any concessional loans, that will come in the form of grants largely, you must bear this in mind. It will be assisting their own economies in terms of the fabrication. Bear this in mind. All of the energy sources, either solar and wind, the components, the equipment that goes in all of that is fabricated, engineered in those countries. None of it is engineered in South Africa. None of it is manufactured in South Africa. So we've exported the jobs. So if you get a so-called concessional loan, you must bear this in mind. You will have exported the jobs and you'll be indebted. You'll become a slave to the lender, as it is so said in the Bible.
Mr. Kgadima, what an interesting conversation. I wish we had more time to touch on COSATU's position, but thank you very much for joining us today. And that's it. That was energy expert Tshepo Kgadima talking to us ahead of COP26. A very interesting conversation. I'll still to come.